We will cover some of it. Okay, back to that issue of fractals and butterfly effects and that whole business that by the time you look at chaotic systems that are determinist but aperiodic, all of that, when they seem to be lines crossing, getting back into the same spot, look closely enough and they're not going to actually be touching. And the centerpiece of why that matters was that whole business of, these both appear to be the same, and take them out a decimal place and they're actually different, and a gazillion decimal places out. And the entire sort of rationale for thinking in that way is the notion that a very small difference here can make a difference one step to the left. And a million decimal places out there, a small difference will make a difference one before that. In a scale-free way, a fractal, this here, a difference here a million decimal places out, is just as likely to have consequences for 1 over as this one for 1 over, fractal, scale-free, all of that. But the critical thing that is encompassed in this is the notion that tiny little differences can have consequences that magnify and amplify into a butterfly effect. So cellular automata are a great way of seeing this principle along with a number of others that are relevant to all of this. Okay, so we start off with the very first one, and this is the one that you no doubt first discovered as a pattern, which made you deeply happy. And if you follow the rules, it was starting, there was this, which way is this facing? Starting at the bottom. Okay, so starting at the bottom, and what you see is these very simple rules, and out of it emerges a whole complex pattern. And we'll be seeing shortly the features of this that perfectly match what the requirements are for emergent complexity. But we'll see as the elements are lots of constituents, lots of building blocks, the building blocks being very simple. They're binary, either they are filled or not filled, extremely simple rules as to how the next generation gets formed. And in terms of the extremely simple rules, none of the rules have anything to do with other than the next generation. It is all local rules built around what the neighborhood is like for each one of these. So you put it together and out come these very structured patterns like these. And this is great. This is very exciting, except this isn't what you usually get. In most of these cellular automata systems, where you start off with an initial condition and a simple set of local neighbor rules for how you get reproduction into the next generations, in most cases, the patterns stop after a while. In the vast majority, they stop, they hit a wall, they go extinct. Aha! Two terms that I've already stuck in here that are biological metaphors start to seem less metaphorical after a while. First off, the notion that going from here to here to here to here represents each next generation, and the notion that, as we were just now, that the vast majority of these cellular automata systems go extinct. They fail after a while. So it's a very small subset. What you then also see is, in some ways, the critical point in this whole business is the relatively small number of starting states that succeed produce a remarkably small number of mature states that all look very similar to each other. In other words, you can start with a whole bunch of different conditions and you will wind up with a smaller number of stereotypical patterns. Half of the cellular automata that wind up taking off look something like this with this pattern. What are we seeing? Convergence. Convergence, the notion that you can start with different forms and they will converge over time. What's this? You just proved you look at the mature form and you can't know the starting state. The other thing is, starting at the beginning, just looking at this line, there is no way you can tell what it's going to look like 20 generations from now. You've got to march through it. In other words, the starting state gives you no predictive power about the mature state. This is a nonlinear system. The cellular automata encapsulates this business that most of these go extinct. Only a relatively few number of mature forms exist. It shows convergence. Very different starting states can converge into the same sort of patterns, and minor differences in the starting state can extend into very different consequences. It shows, in other words, butterfly effects. Okay, so appreciating this a bit. So what we did was then go to example number 2, where we changed the starting state just a little bit here. We shifted around some of the boxes. And what you see is something that looks roughly the same, but it's not exactly the same, but it's the same general feel to it. So that's great. But then we started an exercise of starting off with the initial boxes. This goes that way. The initial boxes evenly spaced with one space between them, and apply the rules from there, and this is what you get. Totally boring, static, inorganic, inanimate. This is what it does for the rest of time. What this exercise then did, going to number 4, is what if we now space 2 boxes between each one of these? And here we have an extinction. This is one of those where it hits a wall and all the next lines are empty. Okay, how about 3 boxes in between the starting states? Okay, another form of extinction. Okay, how about 4 boxes between the starting states, and suddenly something very dynamic takes off. Applying the same rules, and all you've done is change the spacing between the starting states. And look at, for one thing, how close this was to going extinct up there on top, how asymmetrical the pattern is that comes out, and this particular one will stay asymmetrical forever. The ways in which that generated something very unexpected. There is no way you could sit there a priori and say, 1 box in between generates something that looks inanimate. 2 boxes, not going to work. 3 boxes, yeah, somewhere around 4 boxes in between. That's when dynamic systems suddenly take off. There is no way to have known that before without marching through this and actually seeing. Starting state tells you nothing about the mature state. Then we space it even further, and what we get is something similar again. This one is symmetrical. It is somewhat different from the previous one, but it's the same sorts of patterns that come up over and over. So what we've seen here is, by starting state, minor differences, big divergence between going extinct versus being a viable pattern. Minor differences in starting state, big divergence between symmetrical and asymmetrical patterns, tiny differences, butterfly effects. Okay, next, looking at the consequences here of introducing some asymmetry from the very beginning. The one on the left, up on top, has 4 boxes and 4 boxes. It has 8 boxes. The one on top has 8 boxes on the left, and the one on top on the right, just adding in 1 extra box on the side, so it's 4 and 5, adding a little asymmetry, and what you see is a very different pattern. And one of the things you tend to see in these pseudo-animate living pattern systems is starting states of asymmetry produce more dynamic systems, more dynamic patterns than even symmetrical ones. That's one of the only rules that comes out of there. So we're seeing now minor little differences producing major different consequences, divergences, butterfly effects. Now showing this in a different way. And what we've got here are 4 different starting state conditions. The one on the far left is in fact the one from the previous one, the 4 and 4. 4 different starting state conditions where they're not enormously related to each other, the first one against the other 3, but the other 3 have minor differences. And the whole thing is 2 of these are identical after the first 20 generations or so, this one and this one. The 2 of them are identical, and for the rest of the universe, they will produce the same identical pattern, and looking at the mature state, you show up on the scene somewhere halfway down, and you could never ever know what the starting state was. Did it start like this, or did it start like this? A convergency here. And in this case, it's another one of those rules. Knowing the starting state doesn't allow you to predict the mature form. Knowing the mature form, you don't know which particular starting state brought it about, and the only way to figure it out is to stepwise go through the whole process, because you can't just iterate by a blueprint. There's no blueprint. Finally, the last one was giving you, instead of different starting boxes, in each case with the same reproduction rule, the last one was the same starting pattern of boxes with different, slightly different reproductive rules. And what you see here are totally different outcomes, depending on which variant. We have the beloved one on the top left, and you see here, by slightly changing the nearest neighbor rules, if and only if there's one neighbor with this property, if and only if there's two neighbors, if, and working through that way, and you see remarkably divergent outcomes. For one thing, you see that the majority of them produce something very boring, either boring extinct or boring repetitive in a very undynamic way. Only a small subset produce lively, animated, living systems. So we're seeing a whole bunch of biological metaphors here over and over and over, which is these starting states. You don't know the mature, you don't know the starting state. The generations, very simple rules for generations going one to the next. What we see also is the vast majority go extinct and produce either go extinct or some repetitive, very boring, crystallized type structure. A small subset, a tiny subset, produce instead dynamic patterns, and knowing what the starting state is not going to give you any predictability whatsoever of, is this going to produce a dynamic pattern or not, nor does it allow you to look at a bunch of the starting states and say those two are going to produce the same mature pattern. And these are all properties of the evolution of different living systems. So you begin to see, okay, cellular automata, do you see some of these principles? The simplest level out there in the natural world is looking at all sorts of shells, seashells and tortoiseshells by the seashore and whatever's, and they all have patterning on them that is derived from that first cellular automata rule, producing patterns that look a whole lot like these. And go online and look for them, because I didn't get around to it in time, but producing all sorts of patterns in nature. Very common ones. What does that tell you? Very simple rules for generating the same complex patterns and different starting states, cellular automaton properties here. Another thing in a living biological system that begins to suggest this. Okay, so I do this research in East Africa, and every now and then over the years I've gone to this mountain called Mount Kenya, which is on the equator. It's about 17,000 feet. It's got glaciers up on top. So this is an equatorial glacial mountain. And you go up to about the 15,000 foot zone, and there's like, it's moorland, almost everything is dead up there from the cold, and there's basically only like 4 or 5 different types of plants up there. Oh, already only a very small number that survive in that environment, and each one of them is very bizarre and distinctive looking. There's one of them that looks like a little like rosebud thing, except it's about 5 feet across. And then there's another one that has sort of a sprouty thing like this, and then a big central cactus-looking thing that isn't really cactus. So there's a few of these really distinctive, bizarre-looking plants. And in some way or other, that's what it takes to survive up there. So I have this friend who does research up in the Andes, and he does botany stuff up there, and he goes into this one range there that is on the equator and high enough that there's glaciers up there. A glacial equatorial mountain on the other side of the globe. So one day I'm sitting around and looking at some of his pictures there, and suddenly I look and say, that's the exact same plant. That's the big rosebud plant that's in Mount Kenya, and oh my God, that's the tall, sprouty one, and say, it's the exact same plant. How can that plant be over there? And we go rummage around in his botany, taxonomy stuff, and they're completely unrelated plants. They are taxonomically of no connection whatsoever, but what they've done is converged onto the same shape. And in some mysterious way, if you're going to be a plant growing on the equator at about 15,000 feet, there's only about 4 or 5 different ways of appearing. There's massive convergence, and there's only 4 or 5 ways that you could survive an environment like that. You get organisms in very dry environments, and there's like only 4 or 5 ways that you can go about being an organism that's super efficient at retaining water. And those are the only ones you see amongst desert animals, and completely unrelated ones have converged onto some of the same solutions. There's only a very finite number of ways to do legs and locomotion. 2 is good for weirdo things that fly of 6, creepy things of 8. You don't find 7. You don't find 3. You find some of the solutions here are immensely different starting states and have converged. What we see is in these living systems over and over stuff that look like cellular automata, where slight differences magnify enormously, butterfly effects, where you are modeling living systems in a very real way. Most of them go extinct, divergence, convergence, and where each one of these, you get the smaller number reflecting the fact that there's only a limited number of ways of doing rainforest, temperate zone rainforest in the Pacific Northwest. There's only a limited number of ways of doing tundra in Miami Beach. There's only a limited number of ways. In all of these, this convergence, and always reflecting that these are cellular automata. Okay, so hopefully you are now feeling desperately regretful that you didn't spend the last few days doing this, because these are so heartwarming. If you want to read a book that nobody in their right mind should read, it's a book by this guy named Steve Wolfram, who's one of the gods of computers and math, and was one of the sort of people who first developed cellular automata, and by all reports probably one of the largest egos on the planet. And he published a book, self-published it a few years ago, which he can because he is grotesquely wealthy from some of his computer programs, and just showing what a low-key sort of humble guy he is. He called the book A New Kind of Science, just showing that he wasn't just going from some little piddly new way of viewing the world, but here was his new type of science, and the book is about 1,200 pages, and I suspect not even his mother has read the thing. It is so impenetrable, and it sold a gazillion copies, and almost all of them are sitting in people's garages now, wading down drain pipes, because no one can actually read this thing. But an awful lot of what the book is about are patterns in nature coded for by very simple local rules. And the simple fact of that, you've got a lot of very smart people doing the cellular automata stuff, and they can't come up with rules where you could look at something beforehand a priori and know this one's going to survive, this one's going to go extinct, those two are going to turn the same, these two that differ by a slight smidgen are going to turn out to be enormously different. There's no rules for it. And the book has all sorts of cool pictures of the cellular automata looking things out in nature, and go buy it for somebody's birthday and see if they're not grateful for the rest of their lives. But his whole argument there is these show ways in which you can code for a lot of the complexity in the natural world with small numbers of simple rules. This whole business of emergence. This sets us up now for beginning to look at some of the ways in which we hit a wall the other day, ways in which the reductive model of understanding the universe stops working after a while. One version being the problem of not having enough numbers of things, not having enough neurons to do grandmother neurons beyond Jennifer Aniston, that whole business that you simply don't have enough neurons to do that beyond just the rare ones now and then. And what do you get instead? What has the solution turned out to be? This field that people focus on now called neural networks. And the point of neural networks is that information, again, is not coded in a single molecule, single synapse, single neuron, one neuron. This neuron knows one thing and one thing only, which is when there's a dot there. Instead, information is coded in networks, in patterns of neuronal activation. And just to give an